Daniel never expected a simple phone call to pull him into a chain of events that would shake his quiet life. But everything began on a warm evening in Seattle when his longtime friend Michael called sounding tired, stressed, and overwhelmed. Michael, who had just turned 50 and worked long hours in real estate consulting, asked Daniel if he could come over and help him prepare for a last-minute business trip to Toronto. Daniel agreed without hesitation because he respected Michael and had known him for years, and because Michael had helped him many times in the past. When Daniel drove through the familiar neighborhood and parked in front of the house, he noticed the yard lights glowing softly and the curtains pulled halfway. The house felt too quiet for its usual warm atmosphere. Michael opened the door with a grateful smile and rushed him inside, explaining that his flight was early in the morning, and he still had office files to organize before leaving. Daniel stepped inside and immediately noticed how the house felt strangely heavy, as if something emotional was sitting in the air. But he pushed the thought aside and helped his friend without question. Michael moved from room to room gathering clothes, checking documents, and talking about how he might be gone for 3 or 4 weeks depending on the project. He mentioned this quickly, almost casually, like he was trying not to think about it too much. While packing, Michael paused and told Daniel something that didn't seem important at first. He said that his mother, Linda, who lived with him, would be alone for a while and might need help with groceries, lifting things, or handling a few small tasks around the house because she was recovering from a shoulder strain. Daniel nodded because he had known Linda since his 20s and had always respected her. She carried the graceful softness of a woman who had lived through many storms yet remained gentle. She was elegant, thoughtful, and always kind to him. Daniel had visited the house many times over the years, but he never saw Linda look lonely. Now he wondered if maybe he had simply never paid enough attention. Soon after, Michael grabbed his suitcases, hugged Daniel quickly, thanked him again, and rushed toward the waiting cab outside. The door closed, the cab drove off, and the house fell into a deep silence that felt almost too loud. Daniel stood for a moment in the hallway, unsure if he should leave right away or check if Linda needed anything. Then he heard soft footsteps and turned to find her standing in the doorway of the living room. Her presence carried warmth, but her eyes held something he could not name, something quiet and emotional. She smiled in a gentle way, greeting him as if she had been expecting him. She invited him to sit with her for a moment, saying she had just made fresh coffee. Daniel followed her into the kitchen, noticing that she moved slowly, not in a weak way, but in a thoughtful, emotional way. Linda poured 2 cups, her hands steady but her breath slightly uneven. She sat across from him, her eyes lingering on him longer than they normally did as they talked. She didn't ask about work or weather like she usually would. Instead, she began speaking about the quietness of the house, the long nights, and how life had recently felt heavy in ways she didn't know how to explain to anyone. Daniel listened politely at first, but the more she spoke, the more he realized she was not simply making conversation. She was opening a part of her life she had kept hidden. She explained that since Michael had become busier and her husband traveled often for long-term consultancy jobs in Calgary, the house had begun to feel empty. She said that even though people expected older women to be strong and steady, she too had moments of loneliness. She paused many times before continuing, as if trying to choose her words carefully. She told Daniel that in the last few years she had felt invisible, that people saw her age but not her heart, not her feelings, not her needs. Daniel felt a quiet ache in his chest when he heard that, because Linda had always been the kind of woman people admired, not ignored. But now it was clear she had been carrying pain quietly. Then she said something that made him sit still for a second longer, something that made his heartbeat shift a little. She said softly, almost in a whisper, "You are one of the few people who actually listen to me, Daniel. You look at me like I exist." Those words struck deeper than he expected. He didn't respond right away because he feared saying the wrong thing. The room felt warmer, the air thicker, and the quiet kitchen suddenly felt like a place where something personal was happening, something fragile and emotional. Linda reached for her cup but hesitated, her hand trembling slightly. She looked at him with eyes that held years of unspoken thoughts. Then, without warning, she placed her hand gently on top of his. It was a soft touch, not forceful, not inappropriate, but filled with emotion. A touch that said she trusted him more than she trusted most people. Daniel didn't know whether to pull back or stay still, but he stayed, too surprised to move. He looked at her carefully, trying to understand what she meant, if she meant anything beyond needing comfort. Linda's eyes glimmered, not with desire, but with longing for connection, for warmth, for someone to see her as more than a quiet woman who blended into the background of her own home. She spoke again, her voice trembling. "There are things I can't say to Michael or to anyone, but you understand people better than most? Daniel felt heat rise to his face because he didn't expect such vulnerability. He didn't expect this moment at all. Before he could answer, she continued in a fragile voice. I don't want to feel like I am fading from life, Daniel. I want to feel like I still matter. Her hand tightened slightly over his, just enough to show sincerity, not enough to cross a boundary. Daniel's heart raced because at that moment he realized she wasn't simply telling him about loneliness, she was trying to confess something deeper, something emotional she had been carrying alone for too long. But before he could understand the full meaning of her words, Linda suddenly looked toward the hallway. As if remembering something important, she pulled her hand back gently and stood up, trying to regain her calmness. Daniel remained seated, unsure how to breathe or what to think. The moment had been too intense, too real, and too unexpected. Linda walked toward the window, her back slightly tense, as if she regretted speaking so openly. Daniel stood slowly and asked if she wanted him to leave so she could rest. She turned around with a soft smile that didn't fully hide the sadness in her eyes. No, I'm fine, I just said more than I planned to. Daniel wanted to ask what she meant but decided not to push her, not when she already looked so fragile. He told her he would check up on her tomorrow just to see if she needed anything. Linda nodded, her eyes following him to the door with a look that held more meaning than he was ready to understand. As Daniel stepped outside into the cool evening air, he realized that nothing about this visit had been ordinary. He felt something shift inside him, something he didn't know how to name. He didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but he knew one thing very clearly: whatever Linda had tried to say wasn't finished. She had more waiting inside her heart, and sooner or later it would come out. That unspoken truth hung in the air as Daniel walked to his car, leaving behind a house filled with silence, emotion, and a beginning he never planned for. Daniel returned to Michael's house the next afternoon carrying a bag of groceries because he knew Linda would probably need a few things, and because the words she spoke yesterday kept echoing in his mind all night. He tried to convince himself that he was only being polite, only being a responsible friend, but deep inside he felt a pull stronger than courtesy, a pull made of worry, curiosity, and the strange emotional connection that had formed between them in one unexpected moment. When he knocked on the door, Linda opened it almost instantly as if she had been standing nearby waiting for him. Her eyes softened the moment she saw him, her shoulders relaxing as she stepped aside and told him to come in. Daniel noticed she looked different today, not in appearance but in the way she carried herself, softer yet heavier, like she had spent the night thinking about everything she had said yesterday. She led him into the living room where sunlight streamed in quietly, and she sat down with a deep breath. Daniel placed the groceries on the table, took a seat across from her, and asked how she was feeling. Linda hesitated, then said she slept poorly because her mind refused to rest. She said it in a way that told him her thoughts had everything to do with their conversation. She folded her hands, looked down for a moment, then looked back up with eyes full of emotion she could no longer hide. She said, I didn't finish what I was trying to tell you yesterday, and her voice trembled just enough to reveal her fear of opening her heart again. Daniel's chest tightened because he knew this was not a casual conversation, not something simple he could brush aside. He nodded gently, telling her she could say whatever she needed to, and she breathed in slowly before speaking. She told him that her marriage had been fading for years, fading so quietly that even she didn't notice when the distance between her and her husband became wider than the distance between two strangers. She explained how Mark worked long contracts in Calgary, sometimes gone for months, and even when he returned, he barely spoke to her, barely looked at her, barely asked how she was. She said she felt like she lived with a ghost, not a partner, and every day in that silence made her feel older, forgotten, and invisible. Daniel listened carefully, feeling a deep ache in his chest because Linda wasn't speaking with bitterness but with sadness, a sadness shaped by years of trying, hoping, and waiting for change that never came. She said she had spent her life being strong, being patient, being the supportive wife and caring mother, but somewhere in those years, her own needs faded into the background. She looked at him with tired eyes and said, No one asks me how I feel anymore. No one wonders what I need or what I miss. Daniel felt a sharp sting of empathy, because her voice carried the weight of someone who had held pain quietly for far too long. Linda continued speaking, her words flowing faster now as if a door inside her had finally opened. She said she wasn't trying to complain about her life. She wasn't trying to make Daniel feel responsible for her emotions. She was simply tired of being silent, tired of pretending everything was fine when she felt empty inside. Daniel wanted to comfort her, but he didn't know how without crossing emotional lines he wasn't sure he was allowed to cross. Then Linda slowly stood up and walked toward the window, her step soft but heavy. She stood there for a moment, staring outside as if searching for courage, then turned around and faced Daniel with eyes full of vulnerability. She said, "Yesterday when I touched your hand, I wasn't asking for anything wrong, I just needed someone to feel my heart for a moment." Daniel swallowed hard because her honesty felt raw, powerful, and too real to ignore. She walked closer, not too close but close enough for him to sense her sincerity. She said, "You make me feel like I still exist, like I still have worth, like I'm seen." Her voice cracked slightly, and Daniel felt his heartbeat quicken because those words were not romantic in the traditional sense. They were emotional, human, and deeply personal. He asked her gently if she had talked to Mark about how she felt, and she shook her head with a sad smile. She said there was no point because Mark lived in his own world now, full of work, deadlines, and distant thoughts. He didn't hear her anymore, didn't see her anymore, didn't care to ask what she needed. She admitted she envied people her age who still laughed easily, who still felt alive, who still felt wanted or appreciated. Daniel listened silently, trying to process everything, trying to understand why she chose him of all people to open her heart to. Linda took another slow breath and said something that made Daniel's entire world freeze for a moment. She said, "I know you're younger, I know you're Michael's friend, but I trust you more than anyone right now. I feel safer with you than I've felt with anyone in years." He felt a strong wave of emotion, not desire, not attraction, but responsibility and compassion. This woman who always seemed strong was showing him the softest part of her soul, and he didn't know what to do with that weight. She walked past him and sat on the sofa again, her hands shaking slightly as she clasped them together. She said she didn't want to cause trouble, she didn't want to break anything or hurt anyone. She simply wanted to feel understood, appreciated, important to someone, even if only for a moment. Daniel moved to sit beside her but kept a respectful distance. He told her gently that she mattered, that her feelings were valid, that she wasn't invisible, and she looked at him with tears forming in her eyes, not because of sadness alone, but because someone had finally spoken to her with kindness she hadn't received in years. Linda whispered, "It scares me how comfortable I feel with you." And Daniel felt his pulse jump slightly because he understood exactly what she meant. Comfort could be dangerous, emotional closeness could be misunderstood. But at this moment, all he saw was a woman reaching out for warmth after living in emotional winter for too long. She placed her hand softly on her chest as if calming her own heartbeat, and she said she didn't expect him to be anything for her. She just needed someone who cared enough to hear her truth. Daniel nodded and spoke gently, telling her that comfort wasn't wrong and that caring wasn't wrong, but that both of them had to be careful not to let emotions lead them into something painful or complicated. Linda took in his words, her breathing slowing, and she looked at him not with disappointment but with gratitude. She whispered, "Thank you for not walking away." Daniel was about to respond when the sound of the doorbell echoed through the house, loud enough to snap both of them out of the moment. Instantly Linda froze, her eyes widening in shock. Daniel felt his heart jump because he could tell by her expression that they were not expecting anyone. She stood up quickly, wiped her eyes, and hurried toward the hallway. Daniel remained on the sofa, every muscle in his body tense. He heard the door open, heard a familiar deep voice, and his stomach dropped with dread because standing at the door, carrying luggage and wearing a tired expression, was Linda's husband. Mark, home weeks earlier than planned, and suddenly everything in the house changed, everything in the air tightened. Everything inside Daniel's chest froze. The moment Linda's voice met Mark's at the doorway, Daniel knew part two wasn't just emotional. It was the turning point that would decide everything that came next. When Daniel heard Mark's voice at the door, the entire house shifted from quiet tension to heavy uncertainty, and he felt a rush of worry move through him because the emotional moment he shared with Linda only minutes ago now hung in the air like a fragile secret. Linda stood at the door trying to steady her breath while Mark brought his luggage inside. His arrival completely unexpected. His face tired yet sharp as his eyes scanned the hallway. Daniel remained seated in the living room, unsure if he should stand, speak, or simply disappear. But Mark spotted him and forced a polite smile while asking what he was doing there. Daniel replied calmly that he had come to help with groceries and check on the house while Michael was away. Mark nodded slowly, but his expression showed suspicion, not anger, but the quiet type of suspicion that comes from months of emotional distance. Months of not knowing what his wife feels or who she confides in. Linda tried to maintain her calm, moving quietly into the kitchen and offering Mark water while he complained about flight delays, harsh weather, and overwhelming work schedules. He spoke for several minutes without asking how she was, without noticing the tension in her shoulders or the shaky breath she kept swallowing. Daniel watched silently, noticing every small detail, noticing how Mark's voice filled the room with the same empty noise Linda had described yesterday. When Mark finally sat on the couch, he began talking about his project in Calgary, how exhausting it had been, how he might need to leave again soon, and how the company kept demanding more of him. Daniel listened politely while Linda stood behind the counter, her eyes lowered, her hands gripping the edge as though she was holding herself together piece by piece. Mark never once looked at her long enough to see the sadness in her expression, never once asked if she had been all right, never once sensed the loneliness she had confessed so painfully to Daniel. After a few minutes, Mark asked Daniel if he needed anything or if he had plans for the rest of the day, a clear hint that he expected him to leave. Daniel stood slowly, feeling Linda's eyes follow him even though she said nothing, her silence louder than any words she could speak. He said his goodbyes politely and stepped toward the door, Mark giving him a firm handshake while Linda simply offered a soft nod. The moment Daniel stepped outside, the air felt heavy as if he had walked out of someone else's storm, but he also knew this wasn't the end. He got into his car but didn't drive away immediately. Instead, he watched the small window on the second floor where Linda usually read her evening books. He wondered if she would stand there tonight, looking out at a world she felt disconnected from. Eventually he drove away, but his heart didn't leave the house behind, not fully. When Daniel reached home, he tried distracting himself with work, television, anything that could quiet the thoughts in his head, but nothing worked. He kept seeing the way Linda looked at him before the doorbell rang, the fear in her eyes when she heard Mark, the way her voice shook when she said she felt invisible. The next morning, he told himself not to go back, told himself he should give her space, let her family settle, let the tension ease, but his heart wouldn't let him rest, and by noon he found himself walking again toward Michael Street, not to intrude, but because something inside him felt unfinished. When he reached the house, he didn't knock, he simply walked past and kept going, but before he reached the corner, the front door opened and Linda stepped out slowly as if she had sensed he was nearby. She called his name softly, and he turned around, surprised but relieved in a way he couldn't explain. She walked toward him, her steps quick but gentle, her face showing a mixture of stress and gratitude that he hadn't disappeared from her life after everything. She told him Mark had left again early in the morning, suddenly called to return to Calgary, and the moment he left, the house fell back into the same cold silence that had been haunting her for years. Daniel listened quietly as Linda explained that Mark had barely spoken to her, barely looked at her, barely acknowledged her feelings, and she said she felt foolish for hoping that maybe his sudden return meant he cared. But instead it only reminded her of how far apart they had grown. Daniel asked if she was all right, and Linda shook her head softly, saying she wasn't broken, just tired of pretending everything was normal. She gestured toward a nearby park and asked if he could walk with her for a few minutes because she didn't want to sit alone in an empty house filled with too many unspoken thoughts. Daniel agreed, and together they walked down the quiet sidewalk, the autumn wind brushing against them as they made their way toward a small bench near the trees. Once they sat down, Linda spoke honestly, without hesitation this time. She said she knew her feelings were complicated. She knew her situation wasn't simple. She knew she couldn't expect anything from Daniel, but she also knew she needed to be fully honest about what she felt before the emotions inside her became too heavy to carry. She looked at him with trembling eyes and said, "You are the first person in years who made me feel understood." Daniel felt the ache of those words settle deep inside him, not because they were romantic, but because they were filled with truth. He saw the emotional exhaustion in her, the years of being unheard, the years of giving without receiving. He told her gently that she deserved better, deserved warmth, deserved conversations, deserved someone who cared enough to ask how she felt, deserved more than silence and one-sided efforts. Linda nodded, tears forming but not falling, because she had grown too used to hiding her emotions. She said she felt guilty for needing connection from someone who wasn't her husband, but also guilty for staying in a marriage where she felt more like furniture than a human being. Daniel told her that needing emotional support wasn't wrong, that loneliness could shape people in painful ways, and that her voice deserved to exist beyond quiet walls and empty evenings. Linda took a shaky breath and thanked him for speaking with kindness instead of judgment, and she admitted something she had been afraid to say out loud. She said she didn't want to cross any boundaries, didn't want to hurt anyone, but she also didn't want to lose the one person who made her feel alive again. Daniel felt a mixture of warmth and fear because her words were sincere, but he knew the situation was delicate. He told her that he cared deeply, not in a reckless way but in a human way, and he said he would always be someone she could talk to, someone who respected her, someone who valued her feelings, but he also reminded her that they had to protect themselves from choices that could harm her family or cause regret later. Linda looked down, whispering that she didn't expect him to save her or fix her marriage. She only wanted someone who saw her heart, someone who didn't treat her like a burden or background piece in her own life. Daniel placed a gentle hand over hers, offering comfort without stepping beyond emotional boundaries, and she closed her eyes for a moment, taking the warmth of that gesture as if it were the first act of kindness she had felt in years. After a few minutes, she opened her eyes and said she needed time to figure out what she wanted in life, not from Daniel, not from Mark, but for herself. She said she felt trapped between what she was supposed to feel and what she truly felt, between duty and desire for emotional peace. Daniel told her he wasn't going anywhere, that she didn't have to face her confusion alone, and that he cared enough to support her without taking advantage of her vulnerability. Linda smiled softly, the kind of smile filled with gratitude, sadness, and hope. She told him that even if their connection didn't lead anywhere, she would always remember him as the person who helped her find courage again. They sat quietly for a moment, the wind brushing past like a soft whisper of change, and Linda finally said it was time to go home. Daniel walked her back, and when they reached the door, she turned to him with gentle eyes and whispered, "Thank you for seeing me." He nodded, wanting to say more but choosing silence because sometimes silence carried deeper meaning than words. Linda stepped inside, closing the door slowly, leaving Daniel on the porch with a heart full of emotions he didn't fully understand. As he walked away, he realized the story wasn't ending here. It was simply shifting into a new chapter, one shaped by unspoken feelings, emotional honesty, and the uncertain possibility of healing. Both of them now carried feelings they couldn't ignore, feelings that would continue growing quietly, privately, changing them in ways neither of them could predict. And as Linda watched him from the window, the same window she stood by many nights before, she wondered not if he would return, but when, because some connections don't fade. They simply wait for the right moment to guide two hearts toward whatever future they are meant to discover.